Well, welcome everyone to the Resilient Leadership Podcast, where everything we talk about is aimed at helping you lead with a greater sense of calm, clarity, and conviction, even in anxious times. And my name is Irvine Nugent, and as always, I am delighted to co-host this with my friend and collaborator, Bridget Tyre. Bridget, how are you doing today?
Irvine, I am doing pretty darn well. You know, we are recording on a beautiful fall day.
We are.
I know you and I are often impacted by what's going on outside our windows.
Yep.
And it's blue sky, a little crisp in the air. Went for a walk this morning. That got me invigorated and feeling pretty good. How about you?
Yeah, likewise. I was just reflecting with my husband, Fred, the other day, and I was saying, last year, I don't feel we got a fall. It kind of, the leaves came out and they dropped almost immediately. And this, I love the colors. And so it just, this year is wonderful. They're just at peak at the moment. I mean, there's nothing more glorious than walking out the door and just being confronted with an array of different colors. I love it. It's so beautiful.
It really is. And what viewers cannot tell is that you and I are both wearing fall colors today, fitting in perfectly with some of these beautiful leaves changing colors that you're talking about.
Yeah, love it, love it.
So what's on tap for today, Irvine?
Yeah.
Tell the listeners.
So today's topic is called How Do I Decide? Overcoming Hurdles to Decision Making. And the topic came to me recently because I've been working with some clients. And in fact, you just shared you were coaching a client today, actually, about this topic. They were really having struggles around this area. How do we make a decision? And what was interesting in conversations, at least for me, was, each of them was focusing on something different. So it's, what brought to mind is that when we're trouble making decisions, it's not the same thing. Each of us are in our own little world around that decision. And I just thought it would be really fun maybe to explore the decision-making process, what gets in the way, and maybe what are some things that might get us over that hurdle.
Mm-hmm.
So I became curious when I started, I wonder how many decisions we make every day. And someone has counted all those on average. And it'll shock you. The average adult makes between 33,000 and 35,000 decisions each day.
Whoa.
Yeah. And Cornell University is where this has been done. And they said that people make an average of 226.7 decisions just about food alone. And it's like, wow. I mean, that's just crazy. And of course, many of these decisions are made automatically. There's not a lot of thought put into them. It's really subconscious and about good or bad. But however, some decisions on a daily basis are more consequential and they require some thought. And today, I think it's those decisions. It's those ones that really have some consequence in our lives that I really wanted to focus on. So, as we get started, Bridget, I'm just curious, as you thought about this topic and making decisions, do decisions come easy to you? And maybe which ones do you find hard?
Well, it's a great question. And I think if you asked my husband, he would say, no, I don't think decisions come easy to her. He tends to be more decisive in certain areas. I think the decisions that are hardest for me are the ones where I'm keenly aware of the impact they'll have on other people. And if it's going to be hurtful or make things more challenging for people, I belabor those a little bit more. I'm aware of that. I also think sometimes health decisions are a little bit tougher for me. And what this boils down to really is anxiety, right? It's what kinds of decisions bring you anxiety? And because we're each so different in that regard, we're going to struggle differently, with particular decisions. So that's what came to mind for me. How about you?
Yeah. So I'm curious, and for me as well, I think on the whole, I tend to make decisions pretty quickly. And I was thinking about even some major decisions I've made in my life that I never really revisit them. I have this, I make it and I move on. And so I don't dwell on it. But if there is a part where it do get stuck, it's exactly the same as you. And that is if there's a decision that is going to impact a person, maybe adversely impact a person, I do really mull over that. And I think part of that is I don't want to damage the relationship. And there's a lot of fears arising within me. And then I kind of like, is it my fault? Is it their? So I do a lot of kind of, internal language around that. But really it's when the decision is around a person, that's really where I get stuck.
And I'm guessing a lot of our listeners can relate to that.
Mm.
And think about it, as leaders, what are we called to do? Make decisions.
Yeah.
And that can stir up anxiety in our personal lives, but certainly in our professional lives as leaders, because, well, for a whole host of reasons, right? So, Irvine, we love to bring in neuroscience where we can. I know you've found some interesting things to share with our listeners about what the heck is going on in our brains when we're making decisions.
Yeah. So I think, the common kind of, if you ask someone, about when are the best decisions, what are the soundest decisions, we have this notion that it comes from like a cool head. That's the saying, a cool head makes great decisions. And there's a very famous neurologist called Antonio Damasio, and he wrote a book called Descartes' Error. And he talks about this. He talks about our decision making. And, he mentions, the last thing that a person would want is all these pesky emotions interfering with this methodical, logical approach to making great decisions. Formal logic will win the day. And to make the best decisions, emotions must be kept out. I mean, you hear this all the time. And yet, here's this brain scientist and neurologist who said, actually, the reality is very different. That in many ways, he says, I love this, we have dog brains, that basically with a human cortex stuck on top. And, this is the reflection of how we evolved as human beings, that we have this cortex, which you've talked about before, which is, the area of the brain that plans and deliberates and decides. But there's not a second goes by that relationship with that, the dog brain, as he calls it, isn't conferring. And so both of them are not separate. There's there's a relationship and a back and forth without us ever knowing it, but it's in every decision that we make. He boils it down to which I think is really helpful, that really it's a balance of risk and rewards.
Mm-hmm.
That really what we are evaluating in these decisions we talked about of consequence is, what are we risking and what are we trying? What's the reward? Mm-hmm. And just like a lot of different animals, that's part of that circuitry, and it's part of our circuitry as well as human beings. Do we go for immediate gratitude or pleasure, or do we kind of postpone for future? And it's that balance. So if really as human beings, we're kind of focusing on the risk and reward, I think, maybe another element to consider is if we prefer bringing other people in or not, like who do we include? So part of it is what's going on here. And then the other thing about a decision, who are we including in the decision? Bridget, what's your thoughts on that?
Oh, this is a good one, because I recall that one of my earliest coaching clients, like when I first got into, the business of coaching, probably the first 3 months was all around the question you're asking, which is, what was this person's preference and style around how he made decisions in terms of when he brought people in or didn't? Because what was interesting is he thought he should be one way, but he really preferred the other.
Interesting.
So what we're talking about here is the decision styles indicator. It's a continuum, right? And so on one side, you have a preference for being very directive in your decision making. And that's where you make the call and you don't get input. And you think you know what you need to know and you decide, right? And there's certainly times when that's appropriate. But what I invite our listeners to do is think about on this continuum, what is their default preference, right?
Yeah.
You've got that on the left side, directing. And on the right side, you have something either called teaming or collaborating, same thing, where your first instinct is to share the problem with others, to ask them for their input, right? And to feel like there's always more information we could learn about the problem.
Yeah.
Right? And then there's everything in between those two sort of opposites.
Yeah.
So why is that helpful? Well, I think it's helpful because, if you don't know what your default is, that's what you're going to do. And sometimes you're directing when you should be collaborating. And sometimes you're collaborating when you should be directing. Or doing something in the middle, like just getting input and saying, I want to hear your point of view, and I'm still going to make the call, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So being clear where you are on that continuum in any moment in time is important, and then being clear on what your default is. This isn't going to surprise you or our listeners, but I default towards the teaming side of things. I will almost 9 times out of 10, I will involve other people in the decision-making process. In fact, I have to work hard to say, you don't need to involve anybody. You need to think this through yourself. How about you, Irvine?
In this case, I'm very different from you. I certainly devolved to more directing. Even, I'm thinking about some major decisions of my life. I've kept them to myself and mulled about it and made a decision. And then I brought people in. But what I'm looking for there is really not their input. I'm just looking for their confirmation of this great decision I've made in many ways. And that has got me in trouble at times. And I see the value of that. But that's my default. My default is not actually to share it, is actually to hold it and then to come to a decision and then bring people in. And I've fooled myself and think, well, I'm consulting with others, but really I'm kind of confirming what I think I've done.
And don't you think leaders do that too? Like a lot of leaders will say, well, I really want to hear your thoughts, but they've really already decided.
Yeah. And Bridget, that can be a real danger as well, because people sniff inauthenticity a mile away. So, people know if a leader's made a decision and all they're doing is kind of like the perfunctory, like, give me input. So this is really what can trip you up, if it's genuine or not.
Oh, totally. And I've seen that a million times. And so much better to be transparent about where you are on this continuum. Yeah. Okay. So it's so interesting. In our brains, we like to think we're so logical, but emotion and logic are intermingling all the time. And there's no way to separate that out. And we're doing a risk reward evaluation. And then we have our own preference for involving people. It's a lot.
Yes.
So what are some of the common barriers, I guess, that, you've seen, Irvine, that can get in the way of effective decision-making?
Yeah, I think the first one I recall is kind of this fixation with the short-term focus. And, when you've got a difficult decision to make, there's a lot of feelings going on. They're churning within us. And we kind of replay the arguments. It's kind of going round and round like a hamster's wheel. And we agonize, about the different circumstances. And we feel that we're changing our minds from day to day. And yet, if we had kind of put this decision on a spreadsheet, none of the numbers are changing. And there's really no information that's been added. But it doesn't feel that way. It feels like, there's all this information. And really what it is, we've kicked up so much dirt and dust that we can't see a way forward. We're kind of blinded to a way forward. And so therefore, what happens with that is we tend, therefore, just to stay in the status quo. We're kind of afraid to lose what we really have. And it's a barrier to maybe some risk and to making a new decision. And, I came across this fascinating experiment which kind of explains this. And it was with college students, and they were going into class and they were randomly selected to either receive a mug or a Swiss chocolate bar. And they were all about the same value. Several minutes later, they were told that they could choose to switch. If you took the mug, you can get the chocolate, or vice versa. And I would have thought, if I told you to guess, like what percentage do you think would swap? And you probably would think, well, quite a few people would swap. And in reality, what they found is only 1 in 10 people, only 10% of people actually swapped what they had.
That's crazy.
Yeah. And they were kind of influenced by the status quo. It's kind of like, I have this now, it's in the status quo, and it only was established a few minutes later, but we kind of feel safer with what we already know rather than taking the risk of something else. And that's the reality with decisions, that, there's some form of emotional attachment can get in the way of making some good decisions. And this short-term attachment as well, even when things don't make sense, there is a proclivity really to stay with the status quo.
Fascinating.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, Bridget, any thoughts come to mind about, for me, I can resonate with that. How might we avoid that? Like, what's a way of kind of overcoming that?
Yeah, that short-term focus, that clinging to the status quo, right? Well, one strategy that I think can be helpful, and sometimes I've shared this with clients, is, consider getting advice from somebody without having to actually go and get the advice from them. for example, you are struggling with an important decision. There is a lot of emotionality in it that might be interfering with your ability to make that call. And you might say, well, if my best friend in the world had to make this decision, what advice would I give him or her? Mm. What does that do? It just removes you a bit from the immediacy of it and the emotion of it, because it's now you can be more of an observer, right? So I think that can be useful. So like at work, you got a really tough decision to make. And again, emotion might be making that decision more confusing for you. So you might say, well, you know what? If I left this job today and a good successor, a thoughtful successor came in, took my place and had to make this decision, what would my successor do? Again, what are you doing? You're just pulling back a little bit to give yourself some space from both the immediacy of it and the emotion of it. So I sometimes find that helpful for myself.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I actually tried that on, the question about what advice would I give my best friend if they had to make this decision, and I could feel something shift in me. And then I could feel pull back. I'm like, no, but this is me, not that, you know what I mean? But I could feel the distance it created. Yeah. Another thing, and I've heard this said in several different ways, but basically the strategy is a 10-10-10 analysis, where what you do is you look at the decision and the consequences of that decision, not just in the short term. Yeah. That's the first 10, so to speak. Yeah. But then sort of in the intermediate and then in the long term. Yeah. Yeah. You try to really look at all three of those things. Yeah. Because as you said, we so often focus more on the immediate, right? Yeah. I don't know, what do you think, Irvine?
It's so funny. So I'm actually coaching a client at the moment, and the organization they're in has a culture of non-confrontation. So if there is a problem employee, the culture that my client has inherited is don't get involved. Just let. And that's not her approach. What's interesting is, this decision about, do I hold this person accountable in a way that the culture kind of, and so part of that has been this balance between the short term and the long term has really been helpful in that decision.
Interesting.
The short term is there is going to be pain and all the emotions come up, that there'll be resistance and all of that. But then, kind of what's the long term? The long term is, if I'm ever going to change this culture, I have to start. And so it's this balance. And so that kind of focusing on the long term has helped some of the anxiety of reality is that there will be some pain in the short term. And so that was just a really nice frame for them to kind of really make their decision in this case.
I love that. That's a great example.
Yeah. What else? So we've got the short-term focus. Anything else, Bridget, that comes to mind that could be a barrier to decisions and decision-making?
Well, if you're struggling with a decision, this might surprise our listeners, but a barrier is overconfidence, right? And so, if you're overconfident, why are you struggling with a decision? Clearly, you're not confident, but it's not about the decision. It's about how much you think you know. Right? And we tend to think we know more about things than we actually do. And I find that very interesting. And so there was this Yale study where they asked students to rate how well they understood how everyday mundane things operated. Like, I think toilets and zippers were in there, for example. And so they gave themselves a rating. And then afterwards, they were asked to write a little paragraph about how does that actually work, and then assess themselves again. And their ratings went down when they realized, I didn't really know that much, right? Yeah. And don't you relate to that? I think I know more than I actually do. I'm quite certain of that.
Absolutely. I do too. I own that.
Yeah. And then, of course, that can be a barrier to making a decision, because if we think we know, we're so confident, we might be missing something.
Yeah.
Nothing important, Yeah. That's a common barrier. How do we overcome that, Irvine?
Yeah, I think first thing I would think on that is really exploring the range of possibilities. So I think at times what we've done is we think we have weighed everything. We think we have this balance and we've made this great decision and it's good enough, kind of we cut it short almost and make the decision. And maybe what we want to do is is kind of elongate that period and maybe do a better job. What could go wrong? Like, what am I not thinking about?
Hmm.
I have a colleague who worked in the intelligence community instead of a post-mortem, after
Yeah.
like we look back and like, what went wrong? Well, very often in the intelligence community, what they do is a pre-mortem.
Oh.
And so it's kind of before we begin, before the operation starts, kind of really digging into what can go wrong. And I think, maybe that's what we need more of, more kind of pre-mortems and kind of, yeah, am I too confident in this decision? Have I really evaluated what could go wrong? Or am
Hmm.
I just kind of fooling myself? So I think that's one. And then the other one is really interesting. It's kind of this idea of a tripwire. I know this about myself. Sometimes I'll make a decision, I'm going to autopilot, and it's kind of, okay, decision is made, I'm off, here we go. And then this idea of a tripwire, which I think is really interesting, which is actually creating somewhere down the line a wire that when tripped will actually say, oh, let me think about that decision. So let me just give you like a little decision, say your husband wants to start a business for creating ice sculptures for party. And you think, oh my God, that's bonkers. I mean, really, I admire your passion, but, and yet you don't feel you want to veto it. So then
Yeah.
you create a little tripwire. Says, okay, let's start your business, but
Hmm.
maybe let's come to an agreement that perhaps we'll invest no more than $10,000 of our savings. Or you might say, go for it. But if you don't say have 2 paying clients within the first 3 months, then we'll really think about plan B. So it's this kind of tripwire
Yeah.
because so often we get into the decision, we don't think back and we kind of go further down the rabbit hole. And that tripwire can really pull us out of what could be a really bad decision.
Boy, I love that idea.
Mm,
I love that idea. And I think that what often happens is one, we don't have it. And two, even if we have it, we haven't developed shared understanding of that tripwire, right?
yeah.
I have one idea of what it is and you have another.
Yeah.
But I love that. And you know where I think it doesn't happen as much as it should is in the workplace when we make decisions or we set priorities or we invest in a new service or we're starting out with, a new process that we're experimenting with. I don't see my clients put clear tripwires in place sometimes.
Mm,
And then they go about doing this thing and maybe it falls short, but the tripwire happened and nobody said, wait a second, remember we agreed to, pause, or they never came up with it in the first place. So they kept investing in the way forward when it wasn't prudent. Yeah. So I love that idea of the tripwire. That's a good
mm,
one. Mhm.
mm.
These are really interesting barriers. Is there any other one that you're aware of in the research that you did?
Well, yeah. So let's go back to that reality of that statistic. We make between 33,000 and 35 decisions a day. So one of the things is another real one is decision fatigue. And it's the
Hmm.
reality. My God, I mean, how we've talked about living in a VUCA world. We've talked about the stress, the strain of managing the anxiety that we're in. I know you feel the same way, Bridget, but just the pure exhaustion at times of the people that we're working with. It is tiring. The sheer fatigue that comes from making all these decisions. And so that has to have an impact. And what they found is that really what happens is we begin to default to what we know rather than think through some clear decisions. And
Hmm.
that's, the brain, we've always said the brain loves to conserve energy and
Yeah.
it will get into patterns. And so the default. And, a study that blew my mind was one out of Ben Gurion University in Israel. And we looked at the Israeli justice system and specifically around who gets parole. And what they said is they looked at the situations. There was 3 situations and one got parole, the others didn't. And when they looked over the data, over months and months and months, here's what they found that 70% of those who received parole were receiving it in the mornings, and less than 10% were receiving it in the afternoons. So we make decisions all day, and by the end, we're facing fatigue. And so therefore we default, and it's just that very thing of the time of the day had an impact. I don't think we're aware we're doing that. But when you think about it each and every day, big decisions, small decisions, it all adds up. Choosing what we have for breakfast, where we're going to have a vacation, whom we're going to hire, how much we're going to spend, where do we need to cut budgets, all of that. And I think, what we do is we tend to take shortcuts, and many of those shortcuts are just not logical. So that's the reality. I'm wondering, Bridget, any thoughts around how might we avoid these and kind of make better decisions with fatigue?
I just have to tell you that I'm still thinking about that statistic around parole
Yeah.
decisions.
Yeah.
I mean, that is remarkable.
Yeah.
So I think the first, maybe obvious thing is to pay attention to when we're making decisions.
Mm.
Because I don't think that we do. Do you?
No, I don't think so either. I think, yeah.
And I think we get trapped into feeling like we got to make this decision. We decided we would make it now, so we're going to make it now. But we might be so fatigued that
Mm.
when we're making that decision, either collaboratively or individually, we're not working with a full load, right? A full mental load. Obviously, there's real value in bringing in a thinking partner, somebody who's fresh, who
Mm.
doesn't have decision fatigue,
Yeah.
who might bring in a different perspective. I
Mm.
think that's one way to combat that. And I guess the other thing, and you kind of hinted at this when you said, we make 33,000 decisions a day, and a lot of them are sort of almost, I mean, like everything from what am I going to have for breakfast to am I going to take this cookie, after lunch. And I think automating some of our decisions and streamlining them so that, you plan out what you're going to eat for a week, or you lay your clothes out for work the next day so that your brain gets freed up. And I think that is really important when we're in the midst of making some really important changes, that we give our brain a little bit less of a load
Yeah.
to carry, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that. Yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely.
Really interesting stuff here about decision making that I haven't thought about for a good while. And so we've covered a lot of territory as we usually do. What's your thought about how to put this into practice?
I thought about maybe if we'd some default questions that we could turn to and that would really check in with some of the things we've talked about. So here are 5 useful questions to kind of ponder when we're thinking about a decision. So the first one is around urgency. How much time is available? Do I need to make the decision right now? Or actually, do I have a little bit of time? The second one is clarity. How clear am I about the problem? Do I have all the information?
Hmm.
That at times is important. The third one then is focus. Am I really focused on the short term, or have I also really focused on the long term impact of this decision? And are they different? And if they are different, which is most important? Kind of that. So where should I be focusing? The fourth one is that idea of the pre-mortem, which is have I considered what might go wrong? And how does that impact kind of the decision I'm making? And then finally, this last one we were talking about is fatigue. Can we check in with ourselves? How tired am I?
Mm.
I'm also, and kind of, do I need to sleep on the decision because we're chronically undersleep? And sometimes, even in the morning, we think, oh, I'm bright, but you could be coming off a night of bad sleep and just, maybe it's just not the right moment. So really be honest, in that check-in. So urgency, clarity, focus, have a little pre-mortem, and then really assess our fatigue.
Those are great questions because really they cover all the bases of what we talked about, right?
Yeah.
Each question addresses a barrier that often trips us up when it comes to making decisions. So that's a beautiful way to sum up the whole thing. And what I would just add to that to remind our listeners about is, really check in with yourself around what your preference is around how you make decisions on that continuum that we talked about. Do
Yeah.
you tend to be directive, independent, going solo, or do you tend to be collaborative and teaming? No judgment about, it's not about what's better than the other. It's about what is your default. And only if you know that can you then decide, well, what is the best way to be with this decision? And only then can you be transparent with your team about where you are, right? Yeah. So great conversation. Thank you so much, Irvine. And hey, why don't you tell our listeners what's on tap for our next episode?
Yeah. So in our next episode, we're actually going to do like in baseball, we're going to have a doubleheader. And the first part of that double is overall, we're going to have 2 episodes around the pitfalls that often derail good managers. They are quite a few pitfalls. So in the next episode, we're going to deal with the first three, and then the episode after that, the next three. So I'm excited about that because I really think it'll be practical and really help people analyze what's happening.
Me too. Look forward to it, Irvine. Thank you, and thanks to our listeners.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great couple of weeks ahead.
Bye-bye.